By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
Chapter 1. The one that got away the mist over the River Annoy was not so much a weather condition as it was a personal affront. It clung to the heather and seeped into the bones with a damp, chilling persistence that only a Highlander could truly ignore, in PC Hamish Macbeth's case, appreciate. The grey curtain provided excellent cover for a man who was technically on duty but currently occupied with the much more pressing matter of a 10-pound salmon. Hamish stood as still as a heron, his lanky frame draped in an old tweed jacket that smelled of peat smoke and wet dog. Beside him, Lugs, a creature of uncertain pedigree with ears that seemed to have been attached as an afterthought, sat with equal stillness. Both man and dog were staring intensely at the dark, swirling water of the pool below the falls. "Just a wee bit to the left," Lugs, Hamish whispered, though the dog hadn't moved. "He's a cynical beast, this one. He's seen the inside of a poacher's bag before, and didn't care for the scenery." In the distance, the faint, tinny ring of a telephone drifted through the damp air from the direction of the police station. Hamish didn't flinch. To the world and especially to his superiors in Strathbane, Hamish Macbeth was a slow, perhaps slightly dim-witted village bobby who frequently suffered from reception issues in the rugged terrain. In reality, Hamish knew exactly who was calling. It would be Chief Inspector Blair, probably wanting to bark orders about some triviality, or perhaps a reminder about the upcoming Highland Artisan Market. Hamish sighed. The market was the bane of his current existence. For centuries, the village of Lochdubh had managed quite well with a few stalls selling lumpy sweaters and questionable jam. But this year the Sassenach invasion, as the locals called it, had taken a more aggressive turn. The peace of the river was suddenly shattered by the roar of a high-performance engine. It was a sound entirely foreign to the Gleaner sharp, aggressive whine that belonged on a motorway, not a single-track road. "Drat," Hamish muttered, lowering his rod. "There goes the neighbourhood, Lugs." A silver poacher, looking like a sleek metallic beetle, skidded to a halt on the verge above the riverbank. A man stepped out, looking like a caricature of country chic. He wore a quilted barber jacket that had never seen a bramble, pristine green Wellington boots, and a flat cap positioned at an angle that suggested he'd studied a Highland tourism brochure for exactly 5 minutes before leaving London. "You there?" the man shouted, waving a leather-bound clipboard. "Officer! I assume you're the local constabulary?" "Macbeth, isn't it?" Hamish slowly began to dismantle his rod, hiding the lure with practiced ease. He climbed the bank with a deceptively lazy gait, his face settling into a mask of polite, vacant curiosity. "I am indeed, sir," Hamish said, his Highland lilt thickening. "And you would be—" Julian Vane Smythe. "I'm the coordinator for the Great Highland Revival Festival. We spoke on the phone. Or rather, I left 4 messages for you." Vane Smythe's voice was like a serrated knife-sharp, efficient, and thoroughly unpleasant. He looked at Hamish's unkempt red hair and the damp dog with visible distaste. "I trust you've cleared the square for the arrival of the organic cheesemongers." "The square is currently occupied by Mrs. Gallows' sheep, Mr. Vane Smythe," Hamish replied mildly. "It's their Tuesday, you see. They come down for the salt lake near the harbour." Vane Smythe's face turned a shade of purple that matched the heather. "Sheep? I'm bringing in 32 high-end vendors, a film crew from a lifestyle channel, and a man who carves butter into the shape of stags. I don't have time for sheep, Macbeth. This market is going to put Lochdubh on the map. It's about curation. It's about aesthetic." Hamish scratched his ear. "Lochdubh's been on the map since the Ordnance Survey of 1880, sir. We've found our way home well enough until now. Don't be obtuse. I've paid the council a small fortune for the permits. If I see one woolly animal or one rusted tractor in that square by tomorrow morning, I shall be calling your chief inspector. Blair, is it? We played golf last week in Strathbane. He told me you were, well, he used the word ornamental." Hamish smiled, a slow, deceptive widening of the lips that didn't reach his hazel eyes. The chief inspector has a way with words. He's often told me I am a rare specimen." Vane Smythe didn't catch the irony. He was already back at his car, checking his gold watch. "The first lorries arrive at dawn. Make yourself useful, Macbeth. Try to look like a policeman instead of a tramp. And for God's sake, do something about that dog. It looks like it's made of floor sweepings." The Porsche roared off, spraying a fine layer of grit over Hamish's boots. Hamish stood in the settling silence, Lugs leaning against his leg. The dark humour of the situation wasn't lost on him. Julian Vane Smythe was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately made everyone in it wish he was somewhere else, preferably somewhere deep and underwater. "He's a dead man. Lugs," Hamish said softly. "Not that I am planning anything, mind. Ah, but in a village like this, a man who insults both the sheep and the dog is not long for this world. The locals have a very low tolerance for aesthetic when it gets in the way of a good salt lick." Hamish looked back at the river. The salmon jump had a brilliant, silver flash of defiance and vanished into the dark depths. Hamish sighed, turning toward his Land Rover. The fish is the lucky one. He doesn't have to deal with the organic cheesemongers. He climbed into the vehicle, the engine protesting with a series of rattles before turning over. He had a feeling that the market day was going to be more than just an annoyance. There was a tension in the air, a sharpening of the wind that usually preceded a storm or a murder. And as much as Hamish loved his tea and his quiet life, he knew one thing for certain: when Julian Vane Smythe eventually met his end, it would be Hamish who had to find out who did it, all while making sure he didn't look too clever in the process. A promotion to the city was, after all, a fate much worse than a dead Sassenach. Chapter 2, Death by Artisanal Selection. The following morning did not arrive so much as it congealed. A thick pea-soup fog had rolled in off the loch, dampening the spirits of everyone except the midges, who were out in force, sensing fresh, expensive blood. Hamish Macbeth woke to the sound of a heavy mallet pounding stakes into the thin soil of the village square. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the peeling wallpaper of the police station house. Beside him, Lugs let out a low, mournful groan that perfectly encapsulated Hamish's own feelings. The great Highland Revival Festival had officially landed. To Hamish it felt less like a revival, and more like a colourful, loud, and incredibly expensive occupation. By the time Hamish had brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to jump-start a rusted tractor and shared a piece of dry toast with Lugs, the square was a hive of frantic activity. White gazebos with scalloped edges stood where Mrs. Gallow's sheep usually gathered. Men in tight trousers and women in oversized cashmere wraps were scurrying about, shouting about negative space and brand alignment. Hamish stepped out onto his porch, his uniform slightly rumpled, his red hair defying the damp air by standing up in several directions at once. He looked, as Blair would later say, like a man who had been dragged through a hedge backwards, and then told a joke he didn't quite get. "Morning, Hamish," called out Mr. Patel, who owned the local shop. He was leaning against his doorway, watching a group of workmen struggle with a giant, hand-carved wooden sign that read the Foraged Larder. "Morning, Mukesh," Hamish replied, joining him. "A bit busy for a Wednesday, isn't it?" "It's madness," Mukesh whispered, though his eyes were twinkling. "I've already sold 3 bottles of mineral water for £4 each. They don't seem to realize the tap water here comes straight from the mountain and tastes better. It's the labels, Mukesh. People will pay for a nice picture of a mountain even if they are standing right in front of the real thing." Their conversation was interrupted by the unmistakable shrill tones of Julian Vane Smythe. He was standing in the centre of the square, clutching his clipboard like a shield. He was currently berating a local fisherman, Archie McLean, who had had the audacity to park his ancient fish-scaled van near the Organic Wellness Pavilion. "You cannot park that carcass here," Julian shrieked. "This area is designated for the artisan kombucha van. The smell is quite literally polluting the brand identity." Archie, a man whose skin resembled a well-worn leather boot, spat a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Julian's polished Wellingtons. "It's a public road, laddie, and the only thing polluting around here is the smell of that scented candle stall. It's giving my dog the sneezes." Hamish sauntered over, his hands deep in his pockets, Lugs trotting at his heels. Now then, what seems to be the trouble?" Julian turned on him, his eyes wide with caffeine-fueled mania. "Macbeth, thank God. Get this man and his mobile biohazard out of here. We have a film crew arriving in 20 minutes to shoot the traditional Village Vibes segment. We can't have a van that looks like it was salvaged from the bottom of the loch in the shot." "Archie's van is a landmark, sir," Hamish said mildly. "If you move it, the tourists might get lost. They use the rust patches for navigation. I don't care. Move it, or he'll have your badge." Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound. He managed to persuade Archie to move the van mostly by promising him that he wouldn't mention the 3 undersized lobsters Archie currently had in the back. Peace, or a fragile version of it, returned to the square. For the next few hours, Hamish performed what he called passive policing. This involved leaning against various walls, nodding at villagers, and avoiding any task that required more effort than breathing. He watched as the market took shape. There was a stall selling heritage wool, which looked suspiciously like the cheap acrylic stuff from the mainland, a man selling artisanal peat cracker, which Hamish suspected were just burnt oatcakes, and the centrepiece, a massive, ornate wicker display of the bounty of the Highlands. Julian Vane Smythe was everywhere, a whirlwind of discontent. He insulted the minister's wife's jam, told the local blacksmith his ironwork was insufficiently rustic, and managed to offend the entire village council by suggesting they clean up their accents for the television cameras. By noon, the sun had made a brief, apologetic appearance, and the first wave of tourists, mostly wealthy city dwellers in pristine outdoor gear, began to filter in. Hamish decided it was time for a tactical retreat. He headed toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, hoping for a quiet sandwich and a break from Julian's voice. He was halfway across the square when the scream rang out. It wasn't a small scream. It was a full-throated operatic howl of pure horror that sliced through the chatter of the market like a cleaver. It came from the Highland Heritage Gazebo, the largest and most expensive structure in the square. Hamish was moving before he realized it. The lazy bobby disappeared, replaced by something sharper, though he kept his expression one of mild, concerned confusion. He pushed through a crowd of gasping tourists and stepped inside the gazebo. The interior was decorated with stag antlers, draped tartans, and a massive oversized wicker hamper designed to hold the ultimate Highland picnic. Julian Vane Smythe was there. He was, as he had requested, the centre of attention. He was stuffed head-first into the giant wicker hamper. His legs, clad in those pristine green Wellingtons, were sticking straight up in the air, twitching slightly in the final throes of a very undignified death. Around his neck, a limited edition silk scarf printed with a map of the Highlandshire had been pulled so tight it had vanished into the folds of his neck. His face, when Hamish peeked into the basket, was a dark, bruised purple. His eyes were wide, frozen in a look of immense surprise, as if he couldn't believe the aesthetic had finally turned against him. Hamish stood back, pulling a blade of grass from his pocket and chewing on it thoughtfully. The silence in the gazebo was heavy, broken only by the sound of a nearby Celtic harpist playing an upbeat version of the Skyboat song. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the dog, who was sniffing the edge of the basket with professional interest. He wanted to put Lochdubh on the map. I suppose being strangled by one is a start. He looked at the crowd gathering outside, their faces pale and shocked. He knew what was coming. The sirens, the shouting, the arrival of the big boys from Strathbane. His quiet day was over. His salmon remained in the river. And worst of all, he was going to have to talk to DCI Blair. Hamish let out a long, mournful sigh. "Drat," he muttered. "This is going to involve an awful lot of paperwork." Chapter 3. The heavy hand of Strathbane the sirens didn't so much announce the arrival of the Strathbane police as they did warn the local wildlife to take cover. The high-pitched wail echoed off the surrounding peaks, sounding thin and shrill against the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. Two white patrol cars and an unmarked black sedan screeched into the Lochdubh square, scattering a group of tourists who were mid-purchase of some ancient clan stones, which Hamish knew were just river pebbles polished with olive oil. Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the black sedan like a pressurized canister of ill will. He was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of bad cholesterol and grudges. His suit was too tight, his face was the colour of an overripe plum, and he smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and desperation. Following him was Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else, preferably somewhere with a pint and a betting slip. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice carrying across the water to the pier. "By God, I leave you alone for 5 minutes and you manage to let a high-profile Londoner get stuffed into a picnic basket. Is there no limit to your incompetence?" Hamish stood by the entrance of the gazebo, his thumbs tucked into his belt. He looked remarkably relaxed for a man standing next to a corpse in a hamper. "Good morning to you too, sir. It's a grand day for a drive, I am sure." "Don't you grand day me, you ginger toochter." Blair shoved past Hamish, nearly tripping over Lugs. "Get that mongrel out of here. This is a forensic site, not a kennel." Hamish whistled softly, and Lugs retreated to a safe distance, though the dog's expression suggested he held a very low opinion of Blair's ancestry. Blair peered into the wicker hamper. He recoiled slightly at the sight of Julian Vane Smythe's blue-tinged face and the designer Wellingtons pointing at the rafters. Right. Strangled. Obviously. Some local savage didn't like his posh accent, I expect. Blair turned around, his eyes scanning the crowd of villagers who had gathered behind the police tape. His gaze settled on Archie McLean, who was still standing near the edge of the square, looking sullen. "You!" The one with the fish guts on his apron. I heard you were threatening the deceased earlier today. Archie blinked slowly. I told him his candles smelled like a funeral parlour, if that's what you mean. He threatened the man's brand identity, Blair barked, pointing a sausage-like finger at Archie. Arrest him, Anderson. He's the most likely candidate. These Highlanders are a violent lot when you disturb their precious peace. But, sir, Hamish interjected, his voice soft and deceptively hesitant, the market only opened an hour ago, and Mr. Vane Smythe was seen alive 10 minutes before the scream. Archie was over at the harbour talking to the Coast Guard then. Mukesh Patel can vouch for it. Blair turned his wrath back on Hamish. Are you telling me how to do my job, Macbeth? He'll decide who has an alibi. You're lucky I don't arrest you for obstructing a crime scene with your sheer presence. Now, get out of my sight. Go find something to do that doesn't involve thinking. Go direct traffic. There are 3 cars and a tractor out there. Try not to cause a pile-up. Right you are, sir, Hamish said with a compliant nod. It'll just be out of your way then. A very complex case, sir. I am sure your brilliant mind will have it wrapped up by tea time. Hamish turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in a way that suggested he was defeated. In reality, he was suppressing a smile. By being kicked off the case, he was now free to actually solve it without Blair breathing down his neck. He whistled for lugs and began to wander. He didn't go to the traffic, there wasn't any. Instead, he made his way toward the Tummel Castle Hotel. In Hamish's experience, information in a village didn't flow through formal interviews, it flowed through tea, scones, and the occasional dram of whiskey. The hotel's lounge was quiet, the heavy velvet curtains blocking out the frantic energy of the square. At this hour, the only occupant was Mrs. Wellington, the owner, who was polishing glasses with a grim intensity. The pest is dead, then? She asked without looking up. Mr. Vane Smythe has indeed passed on, Mrs. Wellington, Hamish said, sliding onto a stool. Stuffed into a hamper like a Christmas goose. Good riddance, she snapped. He came in here yesterday and told me the decor was suffocatingly Victorian. Then he had the gall to ask if we had any oat milk. In Lochdubh, I told him he could have cow's milk, or he could go drink from the loch. Hamish accepted a cup of coffee and a warm, buttery scone that appeared on the counter. He had a way of making friends, didn't he? Did he have any visitors while he was staying here? Mrs. Wellington paused, her cloth mid-swirl. A woman. Tall, blonde, looked like she'd been carved out of ice. Not local. She arrived late last night in a car that cost more than this hotel. They had a blazing row in the corner over there. Something about the papers and the divorce settlement. Julian didn't look so arrogant then. He looked terrified. Hamish chewed his scone thoughtfully. A divorce, you say? I thought Julian was a bachelor. He certainly acted like one, flirting with anything in a skirt. He was a liar, Macbeth. That much was plain. The woman left around midnight, driving like a lunatic. But I saw her again this morning, lurking near the foraged larder stall just before the market opened. Hamish drained his coffee. A secret wife, a messy divorce, and a missing set of papers. It was a far more interesting trail than Archie McLean's fish van. Thank you, Mrs. Wellington. The scone was excellent. Just catch whoever did it, Hamish, she said, her voice softening slightly. Not because I like the man, but because the screaming is bad for business. People don't want to buy organic cheese when there's a body in the background. Hamish stepped back out into the mist. He could see Blair in the distance, still shouting at a bewildered Archie McLean. Hamish pulled his cap lower. He needed to find that blonde woman, and he needed to find out what Julian Vane Smythe had been hiding behind his curated lifestyle. But first, he decided, he would check the post office. Mrs. Mountjoy, the postmistress, knew every letter that entered or exited the village. If Julian was being blackmailed or served with papers, she would have seen the envelopes. As he walked, Hamish noted a small detail Blair had missed, a single high-heeled shoe print in the mud behind the gazebo, heading toward the woods. It was far too small for a local woman, and far too elegant for a murder. The plot, lugs, Hamish whispered, is beginning to thicken like a good stew. Chapter 4. The lady in the ledge of the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Swilvan Mountains. But the atmosphere in Lochdubh remained as thick as cold porridge. Hamish Macbeth leaned against a stone wall just outside the square, watching the forensic Team 3 men who looked like they'd rather be investigating a car theft in the city clumsily dust the wicker hamper for prints. A tragic end for a man who cared so much about presentation, don't you think, Hamish? The voice was cool, refined, and possessed an effortless authority that always made Hamish feel as though his tie was crooked, even when he wasn't wearing one. He turned to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe standing behind him. She looked, as she always did, like a stray ray of sunshine that had somehow survived the Highland damp. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored tweed suit that cost more than Hamish Land Rover, her blonde hair tucked neatly under a stylish hat. "Miss Priscilla," Hamish said, touching the brim of his cap. "Aye, it's a messy business." Not the kind of curation Mr. Vane Smythe had in mind, I imagine. Priscilla stepped closer, her gaze drifting toward the police tape. "The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. My father is in a towering rage. He says the sirens have put his Labradors off their food. But more importantly, Hamish, do you really think Archie McLean is capable of such a flamboyant crime? Stuffed in a basket, Archie usually just hits things with a wrench until they stop making noise." Hamish let out a slow breath. "Archie's as innocent as a newborn lamb, though don't tell Blair that. He's already picked out the cell, but Archie doesn't have the imagination for silk scarves and wicker work." He looked at her keenly. "You knew Julian, didn't you? From the London circles?" Priscilla sighed, a small, elegant sound of boredom. "Vaguely. He was a social climber who forgot to bring a ladder. He styled himself as a luxury consultant, but in reality, he was a glorified PR man for people with more money than sense. He was quite well known for leaving a trail of unpaid debts and broken promises behind him." "And a broken marriage?" Hamish asked. Priscilla's eyebrows rose. "You've been talking to Mrs. Wellington?" "Yes. Julian was married to Lady Veronica Thorne. Her family has enough money to buy most of Sutherland, but they have very little patience for charlatans. The divorce was particularly nasty. Veronica is a woman who treats life like a fox hunt. She doesn't stop until she has the brush. Mrs. Wellington saw a woman fitting her description at the hotel last night," Hamish said, his voice dropping. "She looked like she was looking for something, probably the Thorne family jewels," Priscilla replied dryly. "Julian stole them to fund this Highland revival nonsense. He thought if he could make this festival a success, he could pay them back and avoid a scandal. He was desperate, Hamish. Desperate men make mistakes and they make enemies." She reached into her small leather handbag and pulled out a silver cigarette case, though she didn't open it. "I saw something this morning before the rush. Veronica Thorne wasn't just lurking near the cheese stalls. She was talking to someone local." Hamish straightened up, his lazy slouch momentarily forgotten. "Who?" "I couldn't be sure from the distance, but they were behind the old smokehouse. A man in a dark coat. They seemed to be arguing over a piece of paper. Then she handed him a thick envelopeth kind that usually contains a great deal of cash." Hamish scratched his chin, his mind whirring. A local complice? Or perhaps Julian wasn't the only one being blackmailed. "Thank you, Priscilla. You have a better eye for the village dynamics than any detective from Strathbane." Priscilla smiled, that enigmatic, half-amused look that always left Hamish feeling both charmed and slightly foolish. "Oh. Just don't let Blair catch you being clever, Hamish. He'd never forgive you for being right." She turned to leave, but paused. "Oh, and Hamish. My father is hosting a small dinner tonight. He's invited the Highland Heritage Board members who haven't been murdered yet. If you happen to be mooching around the castle for a cup of tea, you might find out which of them Julian was planning to swindle next." "I might just do that," Hamish said. "Lugs and I are always partial to the castle's biscuits." As Priscilla walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the damp pavement, Hamish felt the familiar tug of his complicated feelings. He loved her, in his own quiet, hopeless way, but their worlds were separated by a chasm of class and expectation that even a Highland bridge couldn't span. He turned back to the square. Blair was currently shouting at a woman who sold hand-knitted tea cozies, accusing her of using the wool to hide evidence. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish muttered. "We have a lady to track down and a local in a dark coat to identify. And I think it's time we paid a visit to the post office. If there's a piece of paper everyone is fighting over, Mrs. Mountjoy will know if it came through her door." His stomach let out a treacherous growl. The scone from the hotel was a distant memory, and the smell of frying bacon from the gourmet breakfast bap stall was nearly unbearable. Policing is hungry work, he told the dog. "Maybe we'll just stop for one bap. For the sake of the investigation, you understand. We need to support the local economy before the killer finishes it off." Hamish headed toward the smell of bacon, his pace slow, his eyes downcast, looking for all the world like a man whose only concern was his next meal. But inside he was already weaving together the threads Priscilla had given him. Lady Veronica, a stolen fortune, and a mysterious local partner. The market day murder was no longer just an annoyance. It was becoming a very dangerous game of hide and seek. Chapter 5. The postmistress packet. The Lochdubh post office was a cramped, wood-panelled sanctuary that smelled of damp wool, adhesive glue, and the faint, spicy aroma of Mrs. Mountjoy's illicit snuff. It was the central nervous system of the village, and Mrs. Mountjoy was its most formidable white blood cell. Nothing entered or left the parish, be it a love letter, a tax demand, or a catalogue for sensible footwear, without her mental appraisal. Hamish Macbeth entered with the slow, rhythmic tread of a man who had nowhere to be and all day to get there. Lugs followed, immediately heading for the space under the counter where Mrs. Mountjoy occasionally dropped bits of ginger cake. "It's a terrible thing, Mrs. Mountjoy," Hamish sighed, leaning against the brass-grilled counter. A man stuffed in a basket. "It's enough to put a body off their lunch." Mrs. Mountjoy peered over her spectacles, her eyes as sharp and unforgiving as a Highland frost. "If you're here for the gossip, Hamish Macbeth, you can turn right back around. Im art professionnel. I don't discuss the private correspondence of the deceased." Of course not, Hamish said soothingly. "I was just wondering if you had any of those nice peppermint creams left. My nerves are quite shot after seeing those green Wellington boots twitching in the air." Mrs. Mountjoy huffed, but her hand reached beneath the counter. She produced a small white bag and a steaming mug of tea that seemed to appear by magic. Nasty piece of work, that vain Smythe. Always complaining that the stamps didn't match his envelopes. Vivid colours, he wanted. I told him a first-class queen was as vivid as it got in this part of the world. Hamish took a long, appreciative sip of the tea. Did he get much mail, aside from the colouring complaints? Mrs. Mountjoy leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that could have been heard in the next county. "He received a packet yesterday. Hand-delivered it was. Not by the Royal Mail, mind you, but by a courier in a leather suit. Julian signed for it right here on this counter. He went white as a sheet when he saw the return address. And what address was that? A firm of solicitors in London, Thorne, Sterling and Vane. I assume the Vane wasn't him, or he wouldn't have looked like he was about to vomit on my floor. He took the packet and ran out without even taking his change. 3 pence, Hamish. He left 3 pence on the counter. A man like that is either very rich or very scared. Or both, Hamish murmured. Before he could dig deeper, the door to the post office was kicked open, but physically assaulted. DCI Blair charged in, followed by a huffing Sergeant Anderson. Blair's face was now a shade of magenta that suggested a looming medical emergency. "Out of the way, Macbeth!" Blair barked, nearly knocking Hamish off his stool. "We've found it. The motive. The evidence. The whole bloody lot." He slammed a clear evidence bag down on the counter. Inside was a heavy silver hip flask. It was engraved with the initials JVS, but the most striking feature was the dark, viscous red smear across the silver cap. "Found it in the back of McLean's fish van," Blair crowed, his chest puffing out. "An old drunk tried to hide it under a pile of hake. It's covered in the victim's blood. Archie McLean is currently being processed for murder. I told you, Macbeth. Local resentment. A drunken brawl over a parking space. Open and shut." Hamish leaned over, squinting at the flask through the plastic bag. He looked at the red smear, then looked at Mrs. Mountjoy, who was watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "It's a very bright red, sir," Hamish observed mildly. "Almost cheerful." "It's blood, you idiot," Blair shouted. "What do you expect it to be? Tartan? Anderson, get the prisoner to the station. I want a confession before the pubs open." "But Chief Inspector," Hamish said, his voice reaching a pitch of agonizingly slow contemplation, "Archie McLean doesn't drink from silver flasks. He drinks out of a cracked mug or directly from the bottle if it's been a hard day. And he certainly wouldn't steal a flask with another man's initials on it. Archie's a thief of opportunity, but he has his pride. He's a murderer," Blair yelled, heading for the door. "And you're a village idiot." "Stay out of my investigation, Macbeth, or ill have you directing traffic in the middle of the loch." As the door slammed shut again, Hamish reached into the bag of peppermint creams and popped one into his mouth. He looked at the floor, where a small, sticky red droplet had fallen from the evidence bag when Blair slammed it down. Hamish knelt, dipped a finger into the droplet, and brought it to his nose. Then he licked it. "Is it blood, Hamish?" Mrs. Mountjoy asked, leaning over the counter. "It's artisanal blackberry coolies," Hamish said, a dry smile touching his lips, "from the bounty of the Highland stall. It seems someone went to great lengths to make sure the flask was found in Archie's van, and they used the most expensive jam in the market to simulate a struggle. So Archie didn't do it?" "Archie couldn't tell a hip flask from a hole in the ground," Hamish said, standing up and dusting off his knees. The flask was planted, And if the killer is using market preserves to frame people, they must be someone who has easy access to the stalls, someone who knows exactly where Archie parks his van. He looked out the window. Across the square, he saw the tall, blonde woman, Lady Veronica, standing by the smokehouse again. This time, she wasn't talking to a man in a dark coat. She was watching Blair lead a handcuffed, swearing Archie McLean toward the police car. She looked relieved. The chief inspector is about to make a very public fool of himself, Hamish sighed. Which means he'll have to solve this twice as fast just to make sure he doesn't get the credit for the wrong arrest. You're a good man, Hamish Macbeth, Mrs. Mountjoy said, even if you are a lazy one. It takes a lot of energy to be this lazy, Mrs. Mountjoy, more than most people realise. Hamish whistled for lugs and stepped back into the Highland mist. He had a hip flask to trace, a bloodstain to debunk, and a lady in tweed to corner. But first he needed to find out who was selling that blackberry coolies. In a village like Lochdubh, even the jam had secrets. Chapter 6, The Secret in the Source, the square was a theatre of the absurd. While DCI Blair was busy trying to shove Archie McLean into the back of a patrol car, a task made difficult by Archie's impressive ability to become as limp and heavy as a sack of wet coals, rest of the Great Highland Revival Festival continued with a surreal, forced cheerfulness. A piper had begun to play near the harbour, the mournful skirl of the pipes competing with the aggressive bass of a nearby smoothie van. Hamish Macbeth watched the spectacle from a distance, leaning against the damp stone of the old bridge. He was carefully peeling the wrapper off a Highland power bar head been given by a sympathetic vendor. It tasted mostly of sawdust and desperation, but it was better than nothing. He's going to have a heart attack, lugs, Hamish noted, watching Blair's face turn an even deeper shade of violet. And then hell blame Archie for the stress of it. Hamish finished the bar and tossed the wrapper into a nearby bin with a sigh. It was time to find the source of the blood. He meandered back toward the square, his pace languid, his expression that of a man who was merely looking for a place to sit down. He stopped at the bounty of the Highland stall, where a young woman with nervous eyes and a very expensive apron was frantically reorganizing a pyramid of glass jars. "Grand day for a market," Hamish said, flashing his most disarming, gormless smile. "Is it?" she snapped, not looking up. "The organizer has been murdered, the police are arresting the locals, and I've just realized I am missing 3 jars of my limited edition blackberry coolies. It's a disaster." Hamish leaned his elbows on the counter. "Missing, you say? That's a shame. It's a very striking colour, that coolies. Betty, realistic." The girl, whose name tag read Sophie, finally looked at him. "It's made with wild berries from the glen. It's £40 a jar because of the labour involved. And now 3 are gone. I saw Julian Mister, Vane Smythe, talking to someone behind my stall this morning, just before everything went wrong. He looked like he was about to faint. Was he talking to a tall blonde lady?" Sophie shook her head. "No, it was a man. A local man, I think. He was wearing one of those thick, dark fisherman's smocks. They were arguing over a large envelope. Julian was clutching it like it was a lifebelt, and he was in the middle of the North Sea." Hamish's eyes sharpened, though he kept his posture relaxed. "And did this man in the smock happen to have a silver hip flask?" Sophie paused, her hand hovering over a jar of honey. "Now that you mention it, yes. He had it tucked into his belt. He looked out of place. Not like the other locals. He was too clean, if you know what I mean. Like he was playing a part." Hamish thanked her and moved on, his mind clicking through the possibilities. A local who wasn't a local. A fisherman who was too clean. And Julian's desperate grip on a solicitor's packet. He didn't go back to the station. Instead, he headed for Julian's temporary officer's small, portable cabin tucked behind the hotel. Blair had already searched it, which usually meant head tipped over the wastepaper basket and looked under the rug. Hamish knew that if you wanted to hide something in Lochdubh, you didn't put it under a rug, you put it somewhere so obvious that a sickie detective would never think to look. The cabin was locked, but the window was of the sliding variety common to such flimsy structures. With a practiced flick of a pocket knife, Hamish was inside. Bugs waited outside, acting as a furry lookout. The office was a shrine to Julian's vanity. Framed photos of him with minor celebrities lined the walls, but the desk was strangely bare. Hamish ignored the drawers. He looked instead at the traditional Highland hearth-decorative, non-functional electric fire Julian had installed to give the cabin atmosphere. Hamish knelt and peered into the fake coals. Tucked behind the plastic glow bulbs was a thick, cream-coloured envelope, sealed with red wax. It was addressed to Julian Vane Smythe, S.K., from Thorne, Sterling and Vane. He opened it carefully. Inside wasn't a divorce settlement. It was something far more damaging to a man whose entire life was built on brand identity. It was a series of birth certificates and bank records. They revealed that Julian Vane Smythe didn't exist. He had been born Julian Higgs in a small, grey suburb of London. He was the son of a failed accountant and had spent 3 years in an open prison for a pyramid scheme involving exclusive wine futures. But the real sting was at the bottom of the stack: a deed of sale. Julian had been selling off parts of the Lochdubh common landland that didn't belong to Himto, a shadowy development group called Highland Heights. He had used the Revival Festival as a cover to bring in investors and show them the prime real estate he was ready to hand over. He wasn't reviving the Highlands. Lugs, Hamish whispered through the window. He was carving them up and selling the pieces to pay off his old debts. But who was the man in the smock? And why would Lady Veronica be involved? Hamish heard the crunch of gravel outside. He ducked below the window line as a shadow passed the cabin. It wasn't Blair. The silhouette was tall, slender, and moved with a grace that suggested a very different kind of upbringing. He waited until the footsteps faded toward the woods. The motive isn't just a divorce, Hamish thought, tucking the papers into his tunic. It's the land. In the Highlands, people will forgive a lot of thingsling, cheating, even a bit of poaching. But you start selling the dirt from under their feet, and you've bought yourself a very permanent kind of trouble. Hamish climbed back out of the window, his expression returning to its usual mask of mild confusion. He needed to find that clean fisherman. And he had a feeling that the answer lay not in the fancy market stalls, but in the dark, quiet corners of the Lochdubh woods, where the aesthetic stopped and the real Highlands began. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, patting his pocket. "I think it's time we went for a stroll. I've a feeling there's a Highland Heritage Board member who's about to have a very bad afternoon." Chapter 7. The shadow in the heather. The woods surrounding Lochdubh were older than the law, older than the clans, and certainly older than the ruffled sensibilities of Julian Vane Smythe. Here the Scots pines stood like silent sentinels, their needles cushioning the earth and muffling the sounds of the frantic village below. To a city man like Blair, these woods were a nuisance of mud and tangled branches. To Hamish Macbeth, they were a library of secrets where every broken twig and flattened patch of moss told a story. Hamish walked with a light, purposeful step. His lazy demeanour discarded the moment he crossed the tree line. Lugs was out ahead, his nose working overtime, zigzagging between the gnarled roots. "Keep a sharp eye, Lugs," Hamish murmured. Our clean fisherman didn't come this way for the scenery. Hamish was thinking about the papers in his pocket. The deed of sale for the common land was a death warrant. The land Julian had been trying to sell Cragan Point wasn't just a scenic overlook. It was the ancestral grazing ground for half the crofters in the district, and more importantly, it was the site of the old village well. If Julian had succeeded in selling it to Highland Heights for a luxury golf resort, the village of Lochdubh would have been choked out of its own history. But a London swindler like Julian couldn't have navigated the complex local land registries alone. He needed a fixer-some-my-own who knew the boundaries, someone who could quiet the local council, and someone who could pass for a local when the developers came to visit. Lugs suddenly stopped, his tail going stiff. He let out a low, vibrating growl. Ahead, through a thinning of the pines, was a small, dilapidated shepherd's hut. It was a place usually reserved for hikers or teenagers looking for a place to drink cider away from prying eyes. But parked behind the hut, partially covered by a camouflage tarp, was a vehicle that looked entirely out of place, a dark, mud-splattered Range Rover with tinted windows. Hamish circled the hut, keeping to the shadows of the trees. He saw him thin, the man in the dark fisherman's smock. Up close, Sophie the jam seller's description was perfect. The smock was a genuine piece of heavy-duty gear, but it sat on the man's shoulders with the stiff discomfort of a costume. His hands were smooth, devoid of the calluses and grease-stained nails of a real Highlander. He was busy transferring items from the Range Rover into a small leather satchel. But it wasn't the man that made Hamish blood run cold, it was the woman standing next to him. Lady Veronica Thorne was no longer the icy, composed figure Hamish had seen in the square. Her blonde hair was windswept, and her expensive tweed jacket was stained with damp. She was holding a small, silver-plated pistol with the practiced ease of someone who spent her weekend shooting grouse. "I told you, Peter," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The papers have to be destroyed. If the solicitors realize Julian didn't have the legal standing to sign that deed, the whole investment collapses." I didn't spend 3 years pretending to be married to that little worm just to lose the Thorne inheritance to a pack of crofters. The man Peter sighed. The bobby found the office, Veronica. I saw him going in through the window. He's probably got the file by now. Macbeth? Veronica laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. The man is a relic. He spent his days talking to his dog and poaching fish. Even if he has the papers, he won't understand them. He probably thinks a deed is something you do for a lady at a bake sale. He's smarter than he looks, Peter muttered, adjusted his smock. He was sniffing around the jam stall. And that flask I planted? Blair swallowed it, but Macbeth looked at it like it was a bad smell. Blair is the one who matters, Veronica snapped. By the time the forensics come back on that blackberry sauce, we'll be across the border. We just need that final signature page from Julian's briefcase. It wasn't in the cabin. Hamish felt a twig snap under his boot. It was a tiny sound, no louder than a dry leaf falling, but in the silence of the woods, it sounded like a gunshot. Veronica's head whipped around. The pistol followed. "Who's there?" Hamish didn't move. He held his breath, pressing himself into the rough bark of a pine tree. Beside him, Lugs was a statue of tawny fur, his eyes fixed on the woman with the gun. "It's just a deer, Veronica," Peter said, though he sounded unconvinced. "Let's just get the bag and go. We have the fisherman disguise for me to get back through the village. No one looks twice at a man in a smock on market day." "I don't like it," she whispered. Julian was supposed to be the easy part. One quick argument, a well-placed scarf, and the stress of the market takes the blame. But this village is claustrophobic. They moved toward the Range Rover, the engine turning over with a muffled growl. As they drove away, sticking to the old logging trail that bypassed the main road, Hamish stepped out from behind the tree. He was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering anger. They hadn't just killed a man, they were planning to kill a village. Julian had been the front man, but Lady Veronica and her Peter likely a disgraced lawyer or a corrupt developer were the architects. They had used Julian's debts to force him into the scheme, and when he became a liability, they'd disposed of him like a piece of faulty equipment. "They think I'm a relic, Lugs," Hamish said, his voice low and dangerous. "They think we're just part of the aesthetic." He looked down at his muddy boots and then toward the village. He could see the white gazebos of the market through the trees, looking like toys. "Well," Hamish said, "it's time the relic showed them how we handle investors in Lochdubh." He knew he couldn't just call Blair. Blair would likely arrest Hamish for trespassing and then accidentally shoot himself with the evidence. No, this required a more traditional Highland approach. It required a trap, and for a trap to work you needed the right bait. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out the cream-coloured envelope. He had the papers, and more importantly, he knew exactly what Lady Veronica wanted most. The one thing that wasn't in the envelope, the signature page. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, a grim smile finally touching his face. "We're going to set a table for a very special guest. And I think it's time we let the village in on the plan." Oh. Chapter 8. The bait and the hook. The return to Lochdubh was a tactical manoeuvre. Hamish didn't march back into the square like a conquering hero. He slipped back in through the rear of the curry shop, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. He needed allies, but not the kind that wore uniforms and polished their boots. He needed the ones who wore aprons and held the keys to the village's collective ear. His first stop was the gourmet breakfast bap stall. He found Mukesh Patel there, looking weary as he handed out change to a woman who was complaining that her bacon wasn't locally sourced. "Mukesh!" Hamish whispered, leaning over the counter. "I need you to do me a favour. It involves a rumour, a very expensive envelope, and the safety of the village common land." Mukesh's eyes widened. He knew Hamish well enough to know that when the Bobby's voice went low and serious, the lazy act had been shelved. "What do you need, Hamish?" "I need you to tell every Anand, I mean everyone that I've found the missing signature page for the land sale. Tell them I am keeping it at the police station tonight, because I don't trust the city boys with it. Say I am going to hand it over to the land registry in the morning." "Is it true?" Mukesh asked, his hand pausing over a rasher of bacon. "It's as true as a 3-pound haggis," Hamish said with a wink. "But I need the lady in the silver Porsche and her fisherman friend to hear it. Make sure you mention it near the wellness pavilion. They have ears like bats, those two." By mid-afternoon, the rumour had swept through Lochdubh with the speed of a gale. By the time Hamish was seen mooching a cup of tea outside the station, the story had evolved. According to the post office, Hamish had found a document that would send half of London to jail according to the hotel. He had found Julian's secret map to a buried treasure. Hamish sat on his porch, Lugs at his feet, watching the shadows lengthen across the square. He looked the picture of indolence. He had a battered copy of a fishing magazine in his lap and a half-eaten sandwich on the table. Inside the station, however, the trap was being prepared. Hamish had spent an hour with a pair of scissors, some old parchment, and a very thick fountain pen. He had created a document that looked, at a quick glance in a dark room, like a legal deed. He had even used a bit of candle wax to give it an official-looking seal. He placed the deed inside a heavy metal evidence box and left it on his desk, right in the centre of the pool of light from the desk lamp. He left the back door of the station unlocked to crack. "Now we wait, Lugs," he whispered, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. "A fox doesn't enter the henhouse if the door is bolted. You have to make him think the farmer has fallen asleep over his ale." The evening settled over Lochdubh with a cold, biting clarity. The market vendors were packing up, their colourful gazebos looking like ghost tents in the moonlight. DCI Blair had retreated to the hotel to celebrate his imminent conviction of Archie McLean, leaving the square quiet. Around 11 o'clock, the sound of a car engine distant and refine-purred on the outskirts of the village. Then, silence. A few minutes later, a figure moved across the yard behind the police station. It was the fisherman in the dark smock, but he was moving with a nervous, jerky gait that betrayed his lack of local footing. Behind him, a second figure followed, slender and draped in a dark cloak. Hamish watched from the darkness of the kitchen. His heart was steady, his breathing slow. This was the part he hated confrontation, but it was the only way to save the village from the developers' bulldozers. The back door creaked open. The two figures slipped inside, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dust motes. "There!" Veronica Thorne's voice was a sharp hiss. On the desk, the evidence box. Peter, the man in the smock, hurried forward. He reached for the box, his hands shaking. "I don't like this, Veronica. It's too easy." "Where's the bobby?" "Probably passed out in the pub," she sneered. "He's a local, Peter. Give them a bit of excitement and they spend the rest of the night drinking to it. Just get the paper and let's get out of this wretched place." Peter fumbled with the latch of the box. It clicked open. He pulled out Hamish's deed, shining his light on the forged signature at the bottom. "This is it," he breathed. "The last link. Once this is gone, there's no proof the sale was fraudulent." "Exactly," a voice said from the shadows. Hamish stepped into the pool of light, his thumbs tucked into his belt, his expression one of mild disappointment. Luggs stood beside him, a low, rumbling growl starting in his chest. "You know," Hamish said, "it's a terrible thing to break into a police station. It's a bit like breaking into a church. It shows a distinct lack of respect for the local traditions." Veronica Thorne didn't scream. She didn't even look surprised. She simply reached into her cloak and pulled out the silver-plated pistol. "Step back, Macbeth. You're an annoyance I didn't want to deal with, but I will if I have to." "I wouldn't do that, my lady," Hamish said softly. "The acoustics in this room are very good. If that gun goes off, half the village will be here before you can get to your car. And Archie McLean's cousins are currently outside the back door. Thea very fond of Archie, and Thea even fonder of their grazing rights." Peter looked toward the back door, his face pale. "He's bluffing, Veronica. There's no one out there." "Is there not?" Hamish asked. He let out a sharp, piercing whistle. Suddenly the windows of the station were illuminated by a dozen flashlights. The faces of the villagers Mukesh, Archie's brother, the blacksmith, and even the minister pressed against the glass. They weren't shouting, they were just watching, their silent, collective judgment heavier than any police presence. "You see," Hamish said, stepping closer to the desk in Lochdubh, "we don't need high-tech forensics. We just need to know who our neighbours are, and we know you're not one of them." Veronica's hand shook. The pistol wavered. The weight of the village's gaze was beginning to crack her icy composure. She looked at the forged deed in Peter's hand, then at the silent men outside the window. "You're just a village policeman," she spat, though her voice lacked conviction. "You can't prove anything." "I don't have to prove the murder yet," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "I just have to prove the burglary, and you're standing in my office with a stolen evidence box and a gun. In the Highlands, that's what we call a bad start to a defence." He reached out a hand. "The gun, if you please. Before Luggs decides he doesn't like the way you're pointing it at me." "Fine." The breaking of the ice, the silver-plated pistol looked like a toy in Lady Veronica's trembling hand, but its muzzle was a dark, hollow eye that didn't blink. The silence in the police station was so absolute that the ticking of the old wall clock sounded like the thud of an axe. "Peter, move," Veronica hissed, her eyes darting from Hamish to the faces at the window. "Get the paper and get to the car. They won't stop us." These peasants wouldn't dare lay a hand on me. It's not the peasants you should be worrying about, my lady, Hamish said, his voice as calm as a deep loch. He didn't move toward her, but he didn't retreat either. It's the fact that you've been played. Julian didn't have the signature page. He never did. He was a con man, remember? He told you he had it just to keep you from killing him sooner. You're lying, she snapped. Am I? Look at what's in Peter's hand. Peter looked down at the parchment he had snatched from the evidence box. In the glare of the flashlights from outside, the words were finely legible. It wasn't a legal deed. It was a handwritten list of names, the names of every crofter whose land would have been stolen by the Highland Heights development. At the bottom, in Hamish's sprawling script, were the words, "The Highlands are not for sale." Peter dropped the paper as if it had turned into a snake. It's a fake. He's tricked us. I've done more than that, Hamish said. He reached slowly into his tunic pocket and pulled out a small modern recording Devisith, one high-tech item head borrowed from Sergeant Anderson's desk earlier that evening. Oh. He pressed a button and the room was filled with the clear, sharp sound of Veronica's voice from moments ago. I didn't spend 3 years pretending to be married to that little worm just to lose the Thorne inheritance. One quick argument, a well-placed scarf. Veronica's face went from pale to a ghostly translucent white. The arrogance that had sustained her like a suit of armour began to crumble. Julian was a fool, she whispered, her voice losing its edge. He was going to confess. He was going to give the papers to the solicitors and make things right. He actually started to like this pathetic little village. He told me he wanted to settle here. Can you imagine? Julian Vane Smythe, the man who couldn't live without a personal tailor, wanting to become a country squire. He found something worth more than money, Hamish said. A bit of peace. But you couldn't have that, could you? It would have cost you the Thorne estate. He was an investment, she said, her eyes vacant, and he defaulted. So you met him in the gazebo, Hamish prompted gently, stepping an inch closer. You argued. You took that beautiful silk scarf, the one with the map of the Highlands on it. A bit ironic, wasn't it? Strangling him with the very land he was trying to save. He didn't even fight back, she muttered, a horrific sort of detachment taking over. He just looked at me with those ridiculous, surprised eyes. Like he was amazed that I'd actually do it. Peter, sensing the ship was sinking, suddenly lurched toward the back door. I had nothing to do with the killing. I only helped with the papers. She's the one who he didn't finish. As he reached the door, it swung open with a crash. Archie McLaren's brother, a man whose shoulders were roughly the width of a Highland pony, stood there. He didn't say a word, he simply placed a massive hand on Peter's chest and pushed him back into the room. Stay a while, laddie, the blacksmith's voice rumbled from behind him. The party's just starting. Veronica looked at the gun in her hand, then at Hamish. For a second, the dark undercurrent of the Highlands seemed to rise up to meet her. She saw the strength in the lanky policeman she had dismissed as a fool. She saw the quiet, terrifying unity of the villagers who stood in the dark, protecting their own. "Drop it, Veronica," Hamish said. It wasn't a command, it was a plea for her to end it with a shred of dignity. It's over. With a sob that sounded more like a choke, she let the pistol clatter to the floor. Luggs immediately stepped forward, placing a protective paw over the weapon. Hamish let out a breath he felt had been holding since the market opened. He walked over, picked up the gun, and tucked it into his belt. Archie, Hamish called out to the window. "Go find Detective Sergeant Anderson. Tell him to bring the handcuffs. And tell him to wake up the Chief Inspector. I believe he has a major breakthrough to attend to." "What about us, Hamish?" the blacksmith asked, peering through the door. "Go home, lads," Hamish said, his voice returning to its weary melodic lilt. "The show's over. The land is safe. And I think Mrs. Gallows' sheep can have the square back tomorrow morning." As the villagers dispersed into the night, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies through the mist, Hamish sat down at his desk. He looked at the two prisoners, the broken socialite and the terrified fixer-and, then at the fake deed on the floor. He felt a pang of sadness for Julian Vane Smythe. The man had been a liar and a thief, but at the very end he had tried to be something better. He had died for a village that had never liked him, killed by a woman who had never loved him. "Right then," Hamish said, pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward him. "Let's get the statement started. And Peter, don't even think about the Blackberry Cooley's defence. It's been done." He looked at Luggs, who was already curling up in his favourite spot by the stove. "We did it, Luggs. But now comes the hard part." "The hard part, Macbeth?" Peter asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "The part where I have to convince DCI Blair that he's the one who solved it," Hamish sighed. I've got a perfectly good house here in Lochdubh, and I am not about to lose it to a promotion. Chapter 10, The Credit and the Coffee. The sun rose over Lochdubh with a scrubbed, apologetic brightness, as if trying to make amends for the grim events of the previous day. The mist had retreated to the very tops of the mountains, leaving the loch as still and reflective as a dark mirror. In the village square, the artisan pavilions were being dismantled with significantly less fanfare than they had been erected. The great Highland revival had, in the end, succumbed to the much older Highland tradition of a police cordon and a local scandal. Inside the police station, DCI Blair was in his element. He was standing in the centre of the room, his tie straightened for the benefit of a local news crew that had hurried up from Inverness. It was a matter of sheer deductive persistence, Blair told the camera, puffing out his chest until the buttons on his waistcoat looked ready to surrender. I noticed the discrepancies in the victim's social circle immediately. While my subordinates handled the perimeter, I focused on the financial trail. Once I identified Lady Veronica Thorne as a person of interest, the house of cards came tumbling down. A tragic case of greed, but no match for the Strathbane CID. Hamish Macbeth stood in the background, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen. He was holding a chipped mug of coffee, his face a mask of polite, vacuous admiration. Beside him, Sergeant Anderson was nursing a massive headache and a look of profound skepticism. "You really letting have it, Hamish?" Anderson whispered, nodding toward Blair. "The recording, the weapon, the signed confession from the boyfriend. You handed it to him on a silver platter. Why? You could have been the hero of the day. They might have even given you a commendation in Edinburgh." Hamish shuddered at the thought of Edinburgh. Too many cars, too many sirens, and far too many people telling him what to do. And then what, Jimmy? A promotion to a desk in a grey office? A commute on a bus? No, thank you. I'm quite happy with my view of the river, and the river is quite happy with me. But Blair treated you like a lackey. Aye, Hamish said with a small, sly smile. And as long as he thinks I'm a lackey, hell leave me alone to do my work and my poaching in peace. A man who is ornamental doesn't get transferred to Glasgow. Blair finished his interview and swaggered over to Hamish, his face still flushed with the glow of the spotlight. Right, Macbeth. I am heading back to Strathbane to file the final report. I've put in a word for you. I told the commander you were adequate. You didn't get in the way too much during the arrest. Thank you kindly, sir, Hamish said, his Highland lilt at its most subservient. I am sure the village will sleep better knowing you're on the watch. Just keep the square clean, Macbeth, and get rid of that dog. It's a health hazard. With a final dismissive wave, Blair marched out of the station, followed by a huffing Anderson. The silence that followed was a physical relief. The sirens faded, the news van rattled away, and the village of Lochdubh began to breathe again. Hamish walked out onto the porch. The square was nearly empty now. Mrs. Gallow's sheep had already reclaimed the centre of the road, oblivious to the fact that they had nearly been replaced by a golf course. Mukesh Patel was sweeping the front of his shop, and he looked up to give Hamish a sharp, knowing nod. The secret of how the peasant had trapped the lady would be told in the pubs for years, but it would never reach the ears of the brass in Strathbane. In Lochdubh, some things were too precious to share with outsiders. Hamish. He turned to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe walking across the green. She looked refreshed, her eyes bright with amusement. I hear the Chief Inspector has single-handedly saved the Highlands again. A hero of our time, Miss Priscilla, Hamish replied, stepping down to meet her. My father is quite pleased. He's already drafted a letter to the council demanding they never allow another lifestyle coordinator within 50 miles of the estate. He says the excitement has been quite enough for 1 decade. She looked at Hamish, her expression softening. You did well, Hamish. You saved the common land. Not many men would give up the glory for a quiet life. Glory is a noisy thing, Priscilla. I've always preferred the quiet. Well, the quiet involves a thank you dinner at the castle tonight. My father insists. And he's promised there won't be a single piece of artisanal cheese in sight. Hamish smiled. I think Lugs and I could manage that, as long as there's no film crew. After Priscilla left, Hamish wandered down to the riverbank. He stood in the same spot he had occupied 48 hours earlier. The mist was gone, and the water was crystal clear, rushing over the rocks with a comforting, ancient music. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, bent fishhook he had found in the grass. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the water. The market day murder was over. The outsiders had been sent packing, the local villains were in custody, and the land remained where it had always been under the feet of the people who loved it. Come on, Lugs, Hamish said, turning back toward the station house. "I believe I have a pot of stew on the stove that's been neglected for far too long, and if we're lucky, the phone won't ring for a week." He walked back to his small, weather-beaten home, a lanky man in a rumpled uniform who looked like he hadn't a thought in his head. But as he whistled a low, haunting Gaelic tune, his eyes remained sharp, scanning the horizon for the mech's shadow to fall over the glen. He was the guardian of the peace, the master of the mooch, and the smartest man in the Highlands provided nobody ever found out. Hamish Macbeth went inside, closed the door, and for the first time in days, he put the kettle on for a cup of tea that he could drink in absolute, beautiful silence. Chapter 11. The aftermath of ambition. The village of Lochdubh had a way of absorbing tragedy like a peat bog, absorbing rain slowly, deeply, until the surface appeared as undisturbed as ever. By the following afternoon, the only remaining sign of the great Highland Revival Festival was a single, lonely fluttering of silk ribbon caught in the branches of a rowan tree, and a faint, lingering scent of lavender-infused candle wax near the harbour. Hamish Macbeth sat in the kitchen of the police station, the heavy iron pot of stew finally bubbling on the stove. The smell of mutton, onions and potatoes filled the small room, providing a much-needed antidote to the organic memories of the previous few days. Lugs lay across his feet, his tail occasionally thumping the floor in a rhythmic expression of contentment. There was a sharp rap at the door. Hamish didn't move. In Lochdubh, a knock at the door could be a disaster, a demand for work, or merely Mrs. Mountjoy wanting to complain about the price of paraffin. "I know you're in there, Macbeth. I can smell that atrocious cooking from the road." Hamish sighed. It was the one person who could disturb his peace with impunity, Major Halberton Smythe, Priscilla's father. Hamish opened the door to find the Major standing there, looking like a man who had just won a small but significant border war. He was dressed in high-waisted +4s and a tweed jacket that had survived the reign of at least 3 monarchs. "Major," Hamish said, stepping back to let him in. "A pleasure, as always." "Nonsense, Macbeth. You look like you've been dragged through a gorse bush," the Major barked, though there was a twinkle of grudging respect in his watery blue eyes. He marched into the kitchen and sat down at the wooden table. "I've just come from the council meeting. They've officially revoked the development permits for Cragen Point." Seems the investors have vanished back into the cracks in the London pavement now that Lady Veronica is in a cell. "That's good news, sir. The sheep will be pleased." "Bugger the sheep, Macbeth. It's the principle of the thing. Selling off Highland soil to men who think a haggis is a type of handbag. Insufferable." The Major paused, looking at the stove. "Is that mutton? It smells passably edible." Hamish fetched a bowl and ladled out a generous portion. It was a silent peace offering. The Major ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the clink of the spoon and the wind rattling the window pane. "Priscilla tells me you let that buffoon Blair take the credit," the Major said, wiping his moustache with a linen handkerchief. "Short-sighted of you, man. You could have been an inspector by Christmas." "And what would I do with an inspector's salary, Major? Buy a faster car to get to crimes I don't want to investigate." "I've got everything I need right here," the Major grunted. "You're a strange creature, Macbeth. Lazy as a toad in the sun, yet you see things the rest of us miss. That business with the blackberry jam. Inspired. Disgusting, but inspired." He stood up, adjusting his flat cap. "The village is holding a small purification ceremony tonight at the hotel. No cameras, no silk scarves. Just a few locals and some proper whiskey to wash the taste of that festival out of our mouths. Priscilla expects you there at 8. Don't be late, or she'll come and fetch you herself." After the Major left, Hamish returned to his chair. The silence felt heavier now, flavoured with the realisation of how close the village had come to losing its soul. He thought of Julian Vane Smythe, a man who had spent his life trying to be someone else, only to find his true self in a wicker basket. It was a dark thought, the kind that lingered in the corners of the Highlands, like the evening shadows. He reached for his old, battered notebook and began to write his own private report, not the one he would send to Strathbane, but the one he kept for himself. In it, he recorded the small things. The way the light had hit the silver flask, the nervous twitch in Peter's hands, and the cold, diamond-hard eyes of Lady Veronica. "It's the people, Lugs," he whispered. "The mountains stay the same, but the people, they are the ones that keep a man busy." As the clock struck 6, Hamish stood up and stretched. He had a ceremony to attend, a village to reassure, and a reputation for laziness to maintain. He went to the small mirror in the hallway and attempted to flatten his unruly red hair with a bit of water, though it sprang back up almost immediately, as if asserting its independence. He looked at his reflection with hazel eyes that saw too much, the deceptively slow smile, and the uniform that never quite seemed to fit. He was PC Hamish Macbeth of Lochdubh, and despite the murders, the madness, and the occasional invasion of Sassenachs, he wouldn't trade his damp, misty corner of the world for all the gold in London. He whistled for lugs, extinguished the lamp, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The moon was rising over the loch, casting a silver path across the water. It was a beautiful, quiet, and perfectly ordinary Highland night, just the way he liked it. Chapter 12. The quiet return the morning after the purification ceremony at the Tummel Castle Hotel arrived with a soft, persistent drizzle kind the locals called a fine Highland mist, and the tourists called a reason to leave. To Hamish Macbeth, it was the most beautiful weather he had seen in weeks. It meant the day trippers would stay in their BBs, the aesthetic photographers would hide their lenses, and the village of Lochdubh could finally settle back into its comfortable, well-worn grooves. Hamish sat on the edge of the pier, his legs dangling over the dark, cold water of the loch. He wasn't in uniform. He wore his oldest, most disreputable fisherman's sweater, a garment that had more holes than a politician's promised a pair of trousers that had long ago lost their original colour to the peat and the rain. Beside him, Lugs was occupied with a piece of dried kelp, shaking it with a vigour that suggested he was protecting the village from a sea monster. "Steady on, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his eyes fixed on the point where the fresh water of the river met the salt of the loch. "The monsters are all in Strathbane or London now. We've nothing but the fish to worry about today." The purification ceremony had been a roaring success, mostly because it had involved a complete lack of speeches. There had been a great deal of malt whisky, a few traditional songs that Julian Vane Smythe would have found insufficiently curated, and a general sense of relief that the common land remained common. Priscilla had sat with Hamish for an hour, their conversation easy and light, avoiding the topic of the murder, as if it were a foul smell they had finally aired out of the room. But even in the warmth of the hotel's peat fire, Hamish had felt the weight of his secret knowledge. He was the only one who truly knew how close the village had come to disappearing under the weight of progress. A familiar, rhythmic clump-clump sounded on the wooden planks of the pier. Hamish didn't have to look back to know it was Archie McLean. Archie sat down next to him, his knees creaking like the mast of an old boat. He handed Hamish a thermos of tea that smelled strongly of something medicinal. "Blair's gone, then?" Archie asked, staring out at the grey horizon. "Aye, Archie. He's back in Strathbane, probably polishing his medals and telling the chief constable how he wrestled a gun away from a lady." Archie let out a short, dry bark of a laugh. "The man's a clown. But he's a clown that's out of our hair. The boys at the pub were saying you're a fool for letting him take the credit, Hamish. They say you could have been a sergeant by now." Hamish took a sip of the tea. It was hot, sweet, and contained enough whiskey to preserve a corpse. "A sergeant has to fill out reports on why the constables are being lazy, Archie. I'd have to write letters to myself every morning. It sounds like a lot of unnecessary stationery." Archie nodded slowly. "There's something to be said for staying exactly where you're meant to be." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, wrapped parcel. "Mrs. Gallows sent this. For the dog. She says since his barking didn't wake the whole village during the burglary, he must be a very discreet animal." Inside the parcel was a large, prime marrow bone. Lug's kelp was immediately forgotten as he accepted the tribute with a dignified wag of his tail. "The village is back to normal, Hamish," Archie said, standing up. "The sheep are in the square, the post office is out of peppermint creams, and I've got a leak in the van that needs a bit of attention. Will you be coming by the shop later?" "I might, Archie, I might, but I've a pressing engagement with a salmon first. I believe he's been waiting for me since Tuesday." As Archie shuffled away, Hamish felt a profound sense of peace. The market day murder would soon become just another story told in the winter months, a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and the folly of trying to change the Highlands. The Sassenach invasion had been repelled, not by force of arms, but by the sheer, stubborn weight of a village that refused to be anything other than itself. Hamish stood up, stretching his long limbs. He looked toward the police station. The blue lamp was off, the door was locked, and the telephone was, for the moment, silent. Somewhere in a distant office, DCI Blair was likely yelling at a secretary, but here the only sound was the cry of a lone gull and the soft lap of the water against the stones. He whistled for Lugs, who was now guarding his bone with the intensity of a dragon guarding gold. Come on then. The mist is thickening. Perfect poaching weather. As man and dog made their way back toward the river, Hamish felt the familiar, comfortable coat of his lazy reputation settling back over his shoulders. He was the dim-witted Bobby, the moocher of scones, the man who was too slow to be a threat. It was a perfect disguise, and it was the only way he knew how to live. He reached the bank of the river, the water rushing white over the falls. He took a deep breath of the damp, peaty air. He was home. He was safe. And most importantly, he was exactly where he wanted to be. The Highlands didn't need a revival. They just needed to be left alone. And as long as Hamish Macbeth was on the watch, he would make sure they wear one quiet cup of tea at a time.